Hello, everyone. Welcome to this January the 5th session on the International School of Radical Relationism. Today, we're going to be talking about ethics, activism. Here we have the big question, how radical relationism informs activism, can inform activism oriented to social justice, anti-violence, egalitarianism, and anti-oppression. And the discussants today are, let me see if I can go to the next slide. Birgit Poopuu, maybe I should go back to the first one. Birgit Poopuu, Rebecca Bice, and myself, Monica Sanchez-Flores. And before we start, and to start us in a good way, I wanted to acknowledge I am joining here today from the unceded, never surrendered lands of the Secwepemc peoples in Secwepemc Uluk, and I always start sessions, seminars, classes by acknowledging these and saying that we acknowledge territory to acknowledge the violence of colonization within which we live and continue to live today. It's not a thing of the past. We're seeing it happening again and again in a new format. And it's so important to acknowledge that we live within that violence and that we're working to be critical, counter, and work against this violence. This is the work of the International School of Radical Relationism. I see there's an R missing here and an extra S. Sorry about that, but it's ISRR. And we're going to start our discussion today, but always reminding people that these discussions are posted in our website, and this way we can make them available. All right, now let's move on to the first slide. And in reading this slide, the discussants, Birgit, Rebecca, and myself, we're going to be looking at these questions and trying as best we can to answer it from our perspective, our location, our situatedness. But we ask everyone to start thinking about these questions and also to join in the discussion when the three of us are finished. The first bit, as we can see, is a short reflection on why is it that we put our hand up, the three of us, for this session on ethics and how these inform radical relationism. And so this is a very political perspective. And so that is how we're going to start, each of us taking 5 to 7 minutes to introduce ourselves and talking about why ethics matters to us. All right, Rebecca?
Thank you, Monica and Birgit, for being my thought companions preparing for today. I'd like to reiterate Monica's words. I'm joining from the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation here in so-called Australia, and I wish to pay my respects to them this morning and to all Indigenous peoples joining with us in our conversation today. So I'm going to be quite short in this first part. I'm just going to offer a short reflection on what's brought me here and some of the difficulties I find, or the troubles in thinking about radical relationism and ethics for us to maybe meditate on, reflect on as we work through this morning's session. So I'd like to, thank you all for coming, and I'm really looking forward to learning from you all as we talk this morning, as I try and think more to help. Okay, so my life has been shaped in many ways by the violences that radiate outward from dominant power relations. For me, mostly these relate to patriarchy, capitalism, and ableism. yet I have been sustained and lived through relations of joy, of love, of empathy, and of friendship. And it is this life that led me to the words of Judith Butler, to join a struggle to realise a world where we can all live our lives without pathologization, derealisation, harassment, threats of violence, and criminalisation. And it's this impetus that drew me to radical relationism more generally, and to today's topic specifically, as a person, as a figuration, as a subject, to create a better world, a kinder world, a more loving world is at the heart of this subject, of this figuration, of this person. But how can radical relationism help in the struggle? What is it when relations harm and heal are filled with love and hate, with rage, with fear, with kindness, sometimes simultaneously? I'm just going to offer some tentative thoughts for discussion that we might build on through our time together this morning. It's beautiful to be with a group of people for whom the next part can be quite brief, but within a deep or radically relational worldview, here I'm somehow paraphrasing Marx, I think, nothing is solid, nothing is fixed. There is constant movement and change and fluidity, from which there is a susceptibility at an epistemic level. We are called into being. That subject, that figuration is called into being in response to the relational matrix we inhabit. For me, there is a paradox when we think about ethics, when we think about that susceptibility. For me, deep or radical versions of relationism have a disruptive potential to destabilize dominant hierarchies that appeal to substantial thought. But it also centers our deep dependencies and our vulnerabilities. Susceptibility doesn't have to be conceptualized as purely vulnerability, but it does call and it does emphasize this aspect. So our struggle, our fight, is also moving and changing. My ethics may not be your ethics. We may create our ethics together. I will learn from all of you this morning. I will be changed by the time I finish this hour. So how do we survive and live within this? So at the heart of a radically relational ethics, for me at least, has to be rooted in our dependencies and our vulnerabilities. And I think we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but this brings with it a humility to the limits of our knowing and our being. In this way, to try to be ethical is not a thing or a substance, but it too is a practice, it's an ongoingness, it's a relation, and at some level, and to quote Butler it is to be undone at an epistemic level through our relations. So I'm just going to stop there. I'm keeping it really short, but this is how I come to our meeting this morning. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Oh, there we go. Birgit, go on.
Yeah, I took the mic immediately. Thank you, Rebecca. So I'll be offering like 3 different small little snapshots that I have been embedded in to just kind of illustrate why kind of ethics matters. So I will start by carrying around a question that Mariam Gaba has raised. So how will you lessen suffering where you are? So that is basically a question that I want to always carry around. And since I have started teaching at Tallinn University, I have centered the question in my classes. And for those of you who are aware of the racist, violent context of international relations, a discipline whose first journal was Race Development and who has been part of a lot of colonial violence. The next question that I have centered with my students is really important to me. Even though there has been a lot of change, we're not only dealing with mainstream theories, I still want to center in my classes the question, how can we think to international relations so that humans, very differently positioned humans, matter? Of course, immediately when I say this, I will add, following Lola Olufemi, that it's not only about humans, obviously, that it is about all living creatures. How do we practice what we do so that all living things matter? And this is so vital because IR has been obsessed with theorizing that ignores any contextual realities, the deep wounds that people face on a daily basis. So this is the first snapshot, and maybe a final comment about this, that presently like to bring in this a slightly anecdotal but still practical example of practicing this radical politics is that we are in the midst of curricular reform, and as of I think next academic year, I will be able to introduce a class, People's Power, to my IR students. So we will be dealing with anti-colonial thinkers. We will be thinking about all the people who have actually transformed our world. So this is kind of like a small little change. Okay, so the second snapshot is that for the main part, my research has focused on the Syrian revolution, and I have been interested in learning from the activists how they conceptualize and think about the revolution. And I have to say that I have felt such shame, not what the activists have said, but because when they say that, when they feel that they have the need to say that we are humans, just like you, with hopes and dreams. So the reason why they need to say this, and it's not only because I was talking with them, but they phrased it in this way that they need to let the world know that they are humans, because they felt the need to fight against this label terrorist that gets attached to them so commonsensically. So we can see these, again, these colonial wounds. And this is again where ethics matters, especially when I think about ethics as the pursuit of social justice. And finally, I want to talk like the final snapshot. And I hope that something that we will be thinking when we talk about like how do we practice ethics, what do we need to do as scholar activists? I mean, whoever wants to adopt this label, whoever feels some kind of need, affinity towards it. Anyway, so this September, basically, I was at one point very enthusiastic about creating this network, which I called Academics for Social Justice. And the first paragraph, so I already wrote kind of not the manifesto, but basically a description of what does it mean, right? So I'm going to read it to you, so we can discuss this later. So basically, Academics for Social Justice is a voluntary movement of academics who believe that as academics, we have responsibility to stand up for social justice. and promote it through our research and teaching. Given that our daily lives are touched in different ways by social injustice and that people are oppressed by different oppressive systems, we as academics feel that we must stand up for a more just society by recognizing and seeking to address the shortcomings of current societies. I managed to kind of share this text, which was a draft. I asked people to basically contribute. But then what happened was that the neoliberal academia obviously had its own pressures, grant writing, and then obviously we are all aware what happened in October, right? So I didn't manage to do this. In a way, some people are saying that those of the academics who are involved in this in Estonia, they said that maybe it's a blessing because I was seriously attacked for speaking out about Palestine. So if I would have somehow made this public, it would have been an even more disastrous thing because we don't have the kind of the basis to even talk about what it means to be a scholar activist in Estonia. So we have to contextually think about this as well. And I promise you I will end now. What I want to say is that for me, kind of the radical relational approach to the world means that we need to constantly ask, how can we advance social justice? What is needed from us? And I think that radical relationalism helps us to hold basically the complexity of different oppressions together so that we do not distort basically our wounds, our struggles. But it has a lot of challenges, and I think that we will get to some of them as well, as Rebecca mentioned as well. Yeah, I think that I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Birgit and Rebecca, for your initial reflections. I am also going to position myself in respect to this topic today. I should say I am really a political philosopher. That's what I've done all my academic intellectual life. I published a couple of books on cosmopolitanism. So I work on social theory. I don't see myself as an activist, but more and more as I get myself involved in this work, in healing the various aspects of how this society treats especially racialized people. I have developed a keen awareness that activism is changing the world, is going out there, but also it is, and perhaps this is something that we can discuss. It has to do with presenting a world that can be different to our students in this environment. Academia can be so colonial and oppressive and very much in its own ways about what it is that academics do, whether we create knowledge, what is legitimate knowledge. And this is where I think radical relationism can come in and help us really as academics in this universities, tradition of knowledges, etc. Free us a little bit from those structures, from those substantialist and binary ways of looking at the world and creating knowledge. So I'm a sociologist. That's what my PhD says, but I have managed to walk many different areas, disciplines. I've written a lot, as I was saying, political theory, but also a bit of philosophy, and then I put a bit of biology and physics in my writings here and there, of course, as much as I can, as my education allows me. Currently, I'm working on an approach to ethics that is radically relational, and in this work, I am stressing the ethics part of it, in the sense that um, it is, as Rebecca was saying, everyone has their own ethics. They are particular. They are situated in a cultural or in a tradition, or in how it is that we see the world from our perspective. And so this is why it is ethics and not, to me, not morality, because morality tends to be this more, following Hegel, this more universalistic way of approaching um, what should really be an ethics, that it changes with perspective, with relations, with its situation, its local, and a morality, to me, that is universal in its reach, sounds a lot more colonial, um, than than the validity that the philosophers that support it and that I have written about, Jürgen Habermas, are willing to accept. For example, or John Rawls, those, and another thing that I keep saying, and I see some of my students are here today, but I think a lot about this in terms of how I have been biased in many ways, and keep working at breaking those biases by my colonial straight white man education that I received in Mexico. That's where I grew up, and when I did my first degree, and then in Europe where I did my graduate studies. And that is, I keep calling it that because the Mexican one is it was very looking up to Europe and the representations and the conceptualizations that came from there, especially Northern Europe, and that eventually developed in a bit of a inferiority complex in being from a place where that spoke Spanish, and where the big philosophers say, oh no, those languages are not that great for philosophy and this kind of thing. So my approach comes from looking at and really going deeper from Latin American scholars, Aníbal Quijano, Enrique Dussel, Walter Mignolo, and Nelson Maldonado Torres, who have taken issue with positioning even human rights as something that should be universal and that can be seen as a bit of a colonial imposition, especially in building this world um, that is basically the institutions that have been set up in the world of politics, nation states, even the transnational or international order, the geopolitical order, also the way we create knowledge from Western science, that is very much all of these, and the rights, again, human rights, all very structured by the capitalist system under which we live. Ursula Le Guin, the science fiction author, calls it, and we live under capitalism, but it's not eternal. And she says it seems like it's something that we cannot ever leave behind, but think about the divine right of the kings. It seemed like we could never leave that behind either. So perhaps there is a space there to move away from this and from the white supremacist values that are so directly attached to the capitalist world system. So ethics, as I was saying, in particular, and located on, as I was saying, specific traditions, and also it's deeply, deeply personal. I have worked with compassion, and I have worked with compassion. I'm going to show you a couple of um, books that I published, and there are the covers of these books: Political Philosophy for the Global Age, that was published in 2005, and then Cosmopolitan Liberalism, where I thought I could add something to liberalism and make it cosmopolitan by adding compassion, and all of this in universal terms. And so right now I'm working on a project on race and processes of racialization, and I was telling my editors that I have to write about cosmopolitanism and decolonizing it. And they were like, but you're talking about race. Why would you be doing that? And it connects with the work of Quijano and Dussel and Mignolo in basically saying that cosmopolitanism, as was presented and proposed by the the global north scholars, all white guys, that can be pretty colonial. It's a way of looking at the world in universal terms. And so I think radical relationism can break away from that and present us an actual multiverse where the ethics that there are just uh, um, diverse, and they can also come from diverse ways of knowing. And if that is a position, then that can help us as academics and look into, from this perspective, look into other ways of knowing that could just, as Leroy Little Bear told me once, can build bridges so that we can be looking at things ethically together in that particular way. And just I don't want to keep going too long, but I also wanted to mention that I think a lot about freedom and how it is represented under capitalism, Western politics, democracy, etc., as if it's all either individualistic freedom, that negative freedom, or collective, managed by the state, and that positive freedom. And I think we can just abandon those binaries and have been thinking a lot about how do we represent freedom as other than this, other than that kind of binary, either you're individually free or not at all. It sometimes feels a little bit almost oppressive to present freedom that way, just because it enshrines things like, again, those white supremacy values: hard work, being busy, busy, busy. And as you know, I've embraced the philosophy of Tricia Hersey, rest is resistance. Some of you know this, and it is so important. But Tricia Hersey speaks about something that is also really important, that in dreaming together, in dreaming and imagining together, we can imagine and dream of a better future. And Tricia Hersey is a divinity scholar, and so there's a lot of spirit in her writings. But I also say, and I mentioned this to Birgit and Becca, if you switch spirit for relationality, then we are coming to a more pragmatic understanding of how it is that we are deeply, deeply embedded in this world, in nature. We are organisms, we're individuals, yes, because we come individually packaged in bodies, but those bodies are deeply embedded and entangled, not only in terms of culture and meaning and what we share at that level, but also organically and materially, and linked to one another. As Becca was saying, when we finish this session, we're going to be different. We're going to be different people. And all of that includes what is happening in our bodies as organisms as well, right? So I think a framework such as radical relationism can go a long way in critically approaching the way these institutions, the way capitalism, the ways those really received values of of white supremacy are embedded in the way we live life every day, the silos, as if disciplines didn't touch one another, or things that are relevant for biology weren't relevant for physics or chemistry, or indeed in our social life. And so all of this together, I'm just going to stop right now. I have a little bit more to say, but I think I'm going to embed it in looking and approaching those questions as we wrote them together for that second part. Would anybody of the three discussants like to tackle the questions, or how would we like to proceed? Or just a couple of them? We don't have to go one by one, but
Yeah, I was just thinking that because we had this idea that we would collectively discuss, what does centering ethics for us mean as scholars, and how do we navigate the different components when we think about it in this way. So maybe before the three speakers offer their own ideas, maybe the first question we can ask of everyone else is, what is the responsibility of the intellectual for you? As you can understand from this question, there is a reference to Edward Said, but also so many other thinkers, but you don't necessarily have to address it in those terms. But have you thought about it? If so, in which way? Yeah, so whoever wants to offer some thoughts.
yeah, and I can start a speakers list here so that we all have a chance to say something. I wonder if there's anything our discussants would like to say in response to the questions.
Been talking for a while. I think it would be beautiful just to open it up to see if for a moment, to give a space to exhale. Everyone has been listening. If there's any thoughts you'd like to share on where the conversation is steering so far, or if some of those questions we've got there really speak to you that you'd like to explore further today with us.
Anyone has any thoughts?
Please feel oh,
Melody, go ahead.
Hi there, everybody. Thank you for your thoughts, all three discussants. What I really liked, and kind of what came out from everybody, but especially you, Monica, were mentioning, is this emphasis on compassion and featuring compassion as a core way to perhaps model not just relational thinking or radical relational thinking, but radical relational teaching. And I'm thinking about this, I guess, in context to the next, I think in March, panel that will be about teaching and radical relationalism and everything. And I'm wondering if you as discussants had more thoughts on what it would look like to kind of normalize the incorporation of compassion as a way in or a way to bring kind of radical relationalist frameworks into the way that we teach our subjects, whether those are sociology or media studies. What does it look like to kind of like allow students to come into these questions with an understanding of compassion as legitimate ways of theorizing, different ways of being or seeing outside the systems that they're so used to thinking through. I'm thinking about my students and the way that like, can we use compassion to break across that kind of very strong structural framework that they're coming into our classes with as a mode of teaching relationalism? So those are just the things that I'm thinking about right now.
Just have one, what's the word when you put in disruptor is actually shining that light back on ourselves and how we construct that room, and that our students actually are bringing with them knowledge that we don't have, insights that we don't have, that we decenter ourselves, like we entangle ourselves within that relational net, that relational matrix we inhabit. And I'm not new in this. Paulo Freire, many have come before this kind of comment, but I think they feed in, within education, that kind of teaching and learning. And in my classes on radical relationism, really starting with that this is my position, this is how I have come, but I predate, for example, the digital age. The students, their generations, depending on their ages and stages that are different from mine, different genders, race, sexualities, they are going to, everyone brings these knowledges. So how do we sort of radically relationize and democratize this? We're in such a hierarchical framework. How do we break that around us? How far, to take Birgit's challenge, how far will we go? How far, what risk will we have of being undone? What will we, I know, sorry, this is...
Yeah. And I think when talking about compassion, it's this really big concept that may sound a bit universal. I was gonna quote Bell Hooks and her notions of love as the practice of freedom. And there's this quote that I particularly like on how it's so important to love rather than hate and anger, which is not necessarily wrong. It's the appropriate feeling or emotion to have when people are oppressive and exploitative. It's perfectly appropriate to feel anger and pain and react in that emotional way. But what would it take to go to an even more, and I call this more radical or revolutionary approach to this kind of situation? So when Bell Hooks says, and this is in this essay, Love as the Practice of Freedom, the moment we choose to love, we begin to move against domination, against oppression. The moment we choose to love, we begin to move towards freedom, to act in ways that liberate ourselves and others. That action is the testimony of love as the practice of freedom. And in this little quote, I think there is a lot of teaching being done there by Bell Hooks, in terms of how do we extricate ourselves? I mean, those emotions have to be felt, but then once they're felt, and how do we move towards a productive sense of being that is, and I put it in terms of expansive, and it has to be relational. It cannot be but relational in terms of being expansive towards others, and not just others, as it was been mentioning here earlier. I think, Birgit, you were mentioning it, not just humans, the existence, the living existence in which we situate ourselves, and that may include those rocks, the mountains, the lakes that we don't necessarily see as living. Yeah, I think, sorry, I wanted to insert that here in terms of thinking about compassion or thinking about love, and also thinking about how it's not a universal. We may represent it in terms of, yeah, this universal value, but it is very particular and very grounded and very specific. So also looking at the specific situations in which we find ourselves, teachable moments as well, and how we do that with love and care and not with badly done, or you know what I mean. Anyways, those are my comments for now. I wonder if there's anyone else who would like to participate, get involved, contribute to these reflections.
As people figure out, because we're asking basically about how they practice, on a daily basis of being and becoming a scholar, and we're just adding, like, does there need to be this activist side to it? But in any case, as you kind of think and ponder this, I just want to maybe also throw in another layer of this. So Edward Said, he's not obviously the only one. We can go to Patricia Hill Collins, we can go to Antonio Gramsci, we can go to, who am I thinking? Walter Rodney, in a sense that they use different words, right? So for example, Gramsci said radical organic intellectual. So an intellectual who is constantly very deeply connected to the struggles of the working class, right? So that was kind of, the needed layer. Then Patricia Hill Collins and Edward Said's understanding of what it means to be, what is the responsibility of the intellectual. So Edward Said has said that the intellectual's responsibility is to represent all those people and issues that are routinely forgotten or swept under the rug. And for him, the responsibility is also to be publicly bold when there is a need. So it kind of, links to Audre Lorde's this whole idea that, your silence doesn't protect you. And he goes on to say, and maybe this is something that we can discuss also, the kind of the epistemic justice, the decolonizing wave in the universities and wider as well, that Said believed that the intellectual belongs on the same side with the weak and unrepresented. So in a sense, there was always this kind of idea that not only disrupting the status quo, but also kind of really thinking with the communities of resistance, to use different words. So yeah, what I'm maybe getting at is that how do other people here who also identify as scholars, or maybe they have also other labels, or I don't know, there's different ways of thinking about what is your role in academia. What do you think about this Edward Said's very strong position about kind of aligning, a scholar, intellectuals, aligns with the oppressed, basically?
Sultan?
Yeah, a question to Birgit. In your presentation, you told that you were attacked. Is it the right word for speaking up on the issue of Palestine? Could you be more specific? What do you mean attacked? Harassed, told in class, someone calling for your termination in your job? What's that?
Yes, I was maybe it shouldn't be that literal, but so the media basically attacked me as a scholar and said basically that during my postdoctoral years in the UK, I have brought leftist ideas to Estonia, and I'm this enlightened intellectual. So what they were attacking was basically the impossibility for a scholar to kind of have this very public role as an intellectual, you know, speaking out when there is basically a genocide, you know, something very grave happening in the world. So yeah, this and obviously you get all these hate messages and all of this, and my own institute not really supporting me.
Really?
Yes.
Mhm. So you spoke up, you spoke publicly in the media, and then as a result, you got attacked by you know, journalists or media people.
Yeah, basically they wrote a story on me about
Oh,
me,
a
basically.
hit piece.
Yes.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Okay, I'd like to give you a tentative, quote unquote, illustration of what an ethical, speaking up in a relationally ethical way would have been. And the case, the illustration is going to be the recent resignation. Is it resignation or dismissal of Harvard's president? It's a resignation, correct? Claudine Gay, Harvard's president, a couple of days earlier. You know, she got attacked on the issue of pro-Palestine demonstrations at her university, Harvard, and there was this congressional hearing, and the most vicious attack line by a congresswoman whose name I forgot looked like this: how does calling for genocide sit or relate to sit with the Harvard Code of Conduct? And the response she gave was that it depends on the context. And to me personally, the best illustration that she was not up for her job as a university president was, in addition to being a plagiarist, because she, I mean, officially speaking, the reason of her resignation was that she admitted to being a plagiarist, but she was not familiar with the basics of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is a big problem, because in addition to being a university president, she's supposed to be familiar with the conflict at its basics, at that level, and also she's also a political scientist, and she failed to explain. It even didn't. I'm sure it even didn't cross her mind that supporting the Intifada is not. It's impossible. It's ludicrous. It's vicious to conflate it with calling for the genocide of Jews. Because what's the Intifada? The Intifada is the uprising that started in 1987 against the illegal occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza, and later it evolved. It included also the illegal blockade of the Gaza Strip. So that's the answer she should have given to the panel, to the congression in the congressional hearing, and instead she said something to the effect that, you know, calling for genocide depends on the context, which is to say that she kind of accepted at face value the implication in the question of the question of the congresswoman's question that supporting the Intifada is the equivalent of calling for the genocide of Jews. Does this make sense? Are you with me in this logic? So the only way to conflate the Intifada with the genocide of the Jewish people is by essentializing the Palestinian people as inherently violent, aggressive, and also Muslims, and so on and so on. So to repeat, to me, the best illustration that she was not up for her job as a university president on the one hand, and as a political scientist on the other hand, was her inability to deconstruct the inherently racist question by the Congresswoman. We'll stop.
Yeah, Chris, go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah. I have another question on my mind, sort of unrelated to what Zoltan was bringing, but I was really intrigued by what Melody brought up around compassion, and I was thinking that I was thinking of Levins and Lewontin's book, The Dialectical Biologist, and they talk about the alienated worldview in relation to science, and how where I'm going is, when I think of alienation as a normative feature of Western philosophical and political thought, I think of in the disconnected individual as sort of this normative foundation for ethics and politics, and that alienation, that disconnection, includes a mind-body disconnect. It includes a demotion of emotion and feeling. And it also includes a kind of separation between ethics and reason, or ethics and sort of political reason, that is very problematic. And it seems to me that what we're talking about, or some of the themes that are coming up in what we're talking about, are reconnecting or recognizing connections between things that have been historically disconnected. And I wonder if that sort of resonates, that we're not necessarily looking for foundations. I suppose the reason I'm saying all this is like that someone might come into the group and ask, you're talking about love, you're talking about justice, aren't these just new universals that you're proposing? And my response might be something like, we're not discussing them as foundations, but as forms of reconnection. And I wonder if that distinction is useful. Oh gosh, I'm talking much too long. And I also wonder about Edward Said's point. I wonder if, as I tend to agree in spirit, that as intellectuals, we want to side with the disenfranchised and the oppressed if we're working towards democracy, equality. But representing is, in some circumstances, a little problematic. That when I represent, as Latour pointed out, if I represent you, then I speak for you, which means that you're silent. And if you're silent anyway, then maybe that's helpful. But is there a way we could push Said's formulation a little further and think, instead of representing, or in addition to representing those who are silenced, also challenging the power relations that keep them silent so that they can speak for themselves and be heard? Sorry, that was a lot of different points.
Okay, I can pick up on basically some of the points, unless, like, basically I also don't want Monica, Rebecca, and myself constantly to speak. So if someone else wants to come with any thought, question, then please feel free. Okay, otherwise, what I want to add to this thought about Said was that I think that he didn't mean that in a sense that, intellectuals need to speak on behalf, of the oppressed. It was rather that I think that since the beginning of his career, he has been looking and zooming into this, how, unfairly kind of, especially Palestinians, have been represented, in a sense that they have already been made into non-humans, basically, a class of people who cannot speak. And I totally take this point in a sense that obviously the whole idea of this speaking is to also struggle against these dominant oppressive structures. If I would think like the two authors whose thinking around this activist scholar label I really like are Remy Joseph Salisbury and Laura Connelly. They wrote this book, Anti-Racist Scholar Activism, and it's very much based on their interviews with actually these activist scholars in the UK. And I like their idea of something that I want to work towards now, is that they offer these different, let's say, activities or, different things that we can do as activist scholars. But one of them is kind of being their embeddedness in communities of resistance and working in service. So that means that we actually enter into dialogue, not just as researchers in a sense that we approach someone, I need an interview from you, but rather that we actually are involved and know about the struggles and are there for different things. And I think that probably Rebecca can speak towards this, like what it means to work closely with certain communities who are suffering. But about Soltan's point, I didn't actually get like what was the question there, or what was the okay.
Yeah, what I was saying that she was not able to formulate the correct answer to the Congresswoman's propagandistic question. Okay, she was not able to explain that supporting the Intifada has nothing to do with calling for genocide, because, as all popular movements against oppression, like all uprisings, have come in different flavors, and all of them have a violent subclass or variety. Even the ANC struggle in South Africa against the apartheid regime included a terrorist streak, that's for sure. So, no one in their right mind would draw the conclusion that during the 1980s, supporting the ANC was the equivalent or tantamount to supporting terrorism. That would be ludicrous.
And then,
you see my point?
Can I contribute something maybe? What I'm thinking is, Sultan, and this may be relevant to the discussion in general beyond specific conflicts, although it's very useful to have those as illustrating, is to say that the problem with substantialism or substantialist representations is that they're either or. Either you're a goodie or a baddie. I was watching Die Hard yesterday with my kid, and I was just going, oh my God, these people are presented as they can be killed because they're bad. So boom, kill them. And it's similar in a sense to what is happening here, representing and again, this is linked with those white supremacist values of capitalism when and the underbelly of modernity, coloniality that Dussel and Quijano have proposed. This modernity, yes, but it also has this side to it that is it's colonial, it looks down on certain groups of people, and that's why it gets us attached to that other set of ideas or even values in white supremacy. So it kind of normalizes that genocidal, and it's okay then because they're not people. But that all already is embedded in this question of the modernity or the coloniality that that these authors are proposing, that it comes with this sense that the individual person, and when we think of it, the individual person, we think of a person that's racialized, is a very powerful entity. And that power came from awareness of the colonial order that was being created way before the modern colonial, settler colonial regimes, way before in the Indias, right? When they supposedly discovered them, but they were there all the time, in the beginning of the 1500s. So I would say it all has to do with this substantialist binary either or, and then if it's depending on the circumstances, if they're lesser than human, then it's okay. When it's not even, it's the representation, and even the structure of the representation itself is wrong, right? Considering the deep entanglement, radical relational entanglement of life. And I saw Melody's hand before Chris, and then Chris.
Yeah, just bouncing off what you were just saying, the point about, our kind of instincts to revert back to this logic, these binary logics of judgment, good or the bad, as a means to establish and articulate our politics is so rampant within academia. And I feel like it brings us back to a potential tactic of teaching perhaps complex compassion in our classes, right? I found that I very often encountered not only students thinking in these kind of binary mechanisms of, well, is this a meme good? Is this meme good or bad? Or is this user good or bad? Or is this, but I found myself coming into that language as well, right? Of like, what do you think this is good for society or not? And these types of things. So I wonder if, we can maybe articulate another means of including radical relationalism in our teaching is, teaching ways to think about conflict and to think about compassion in ways that are more complex than this binary structure and that break past that binary structure, so that our students aren't necessarily thinking, in terms of abstract theory of, oh, I'm using, relationalism to think about this conflict, but so that they can be trained to approach conflicts in ways that aren't necessarily reproducing those binary logics and structures that, as you say, also recreate structures of, hierarchy and white supremacy, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what I took from all of that, was there's something interesting about using this concept of perhaps complex compassion as a means of teaching radical relationalism, but also in the end, it's more about using radical relationalism to teach better and more radical ways of being compassionate to our students, I think.
Thank you, Melody. Chris, did you want to say, and then Rebecca?
Yeah, thank you. This is going down a really interesting path. So, by the way, I love the phrase complex compassion. And a phrase I've been bandying about in my head lately is horizontal solidarity. And I wonder if there's some affinities between the two ideas. But talking about binaries, I wonder if the good-evil binary maps onto the community, not in my community binary. Like, you're part of my moral community, you're outside of my moral community, outside of my moral universal moral obligation, as Helen Fine put it. And if we are then disrupting binaries around, say, good and evil, are we also disrupting binaries around belonging, not belonging? That being part of my community is no longer an all or nothing proposition. So whereas, for instance, a universalist humanism would say all humans belong to a single moral community, that's the sort of standard. We might be saying something a little different, which is because there is the problems with asserting this universal moral human community that can be imperialist. So yeah, that seems interesting to me to play with. And also around authority, because I think in Western culture, we're really used to thinking of community in terms of subordination to a common authority, right? You're loyal to my king, so we're in the same community. I mean, I'm being a little anachronistic, but anyway, so I'll stop there.
Thanks, Chris. I saw Jonathan's hand come up as first time speaker, so I'm going to let Jonathan talk first and then Becca.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for all the interesting thoughts. I'm going to have to pick a few of the thoughts that I've had over the last few minutes. Okay, maybe it's because Chris opened something that I think is absolutely true. There's a distinction that's sometimes made between first order and second order moral claims that kind of links to this issue of whether, when we talk of good and evil people or something, is there a distinction of like moral communities there? So first order moral claims are claims like what we should do, or claims like you should do this. This is something we discuss, like what's the thing that we consider to be the right thing to do. And second order moral claims are exactly about like who is virtuous, who is evil. And a lot of Elizabeth Anderson has a great article about this, how a lot of our moral talk has become kind of when we talk about racism, for example, or especially with Palestine, maybe when we make specific moral claims that maybe Israel shouldn't indiscriminately bomb Gaza, then those who, it's not simply a matter of should Israel do this or not. This claim is interpreted as really not being about the claim itself, but actually about, it's an us or them claim, that people who say this are really, the real motivations are somewhere else. So yeah, absolutely. We in a classroom setting as well, it's I think we should center these first order claims. But okay, going very quickly to answer Birgit's one of questions, or actually maybe raise a question myself. I'm kind of struggling on this. So what is the responsibility of the intellectual? We talked a lot about the activism of what we would expect from at least socially conscious intellectuals about their activism, but the question of what can the scholarly part and its contribution to the social movement. So as the people like us, we're paid to do quite a cushy job in institutions. That work should somehow, provide something that the social people in these social movements who don't have these luxuries that we do, that's something that they can provide. Do we, as I think most of us would consider ourselves as social scientists, do we have some sort of knowledge to produce that only we can produce? Is there a division of labor? And if not, I mean, why are people paying us? Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Is there anyone who would like to reply, or maybe Rebecca? Or is it different? But it's a lot of food for thought there. So important to consider the privilege. Okay, Becca.
Thank you, Jonathan. I would like to hold some of those points that you raised, because I come into this conversation slightly differently. I think I don't know everyone's story, but rather than an activist academic, I am in the movement, in social movement. So that, again, just to challenge this binary setup of the academic activist or the activist academic that we move around. But just a few things that have come up quickly. I think the epistemological question that your thinking points to, Jonathan, around how do we what is knowledge? How is it produced? How do we come to that? And I think there is a lot of guidance in feminist thought and decolonizing methodologies. There are lots of spaces here for those whose work is more centered in the academy. I think radical relationism is so aligned to, when I was more in the academy, I was thinking, sometimes I would speak to some women and I would think, they say this better than I just need to publish their transcripts. This is that they have the knowledge. So what is my role? But I would speak to many women and they would have many opinions. They had many interpretations. They had many ways of making sense of a process that we were all engaged with. So I came to imagine my role as an interpreter of interpretations. So there always being this sort of humility to it and what I was doing in relation to the women that I worked with. And deeply rooted within academia and maybe good. But, within academia, there is this problem, and sometimes I think it sits within radically relational worldviews as well, is, for me, radical relationism troubles the authority of the author. Because it troubles, and some of us have talked about this, when I was doing my PhD, when I put in my ethics, I wanted to go back to the women I was working with and we could talk about my interpretation of their interpretations, right? They could trouble my work, because what is my work without their, I offer one. And the university rejected that because they said for a PhD, it was about my contribution to knowledge, the individual's contribution to knowledge, this claim on authorship. So I think radical relationism, it makes me a figuration, it makes me a subject that is entangled with the people whom I work with and for, troubles that idea of authorship deeply. And now that I'm outside, I'm increasingly not wanting to write anything by myself, because in some ways it obfuscates in some ways it reifies individualism. And I think of groups like the Combahee River Collective as a sort of inspiration for decentering individualism that so much is at the heart of academia. Like, some people are like, why did academia become like this wheelhouse of neoliberalism? And it's like, because the ego, the individual, is at the heart of the Western construction of the endeavor. Anyway, so that's kind of one point that we could maybe talk about. And I think some of this we're thinking about to trouble some of this is these conversations we are having about people living or dying, surviving or being destroyed. We need to stay connected to that. There's always this this thing leveled at academia that we become this ivory tower, this detachment. And so for me, radical relationism has this potential to destabilize, because a lot of that violence is, those binaries are substantial, and that many violences are enacted through appeals to substantialism, appeal to a specific community, appeal to a particular identity. But sometimes to survive within a framework of substantialism, we have to use those tools to a certain extent. And I here think of Spivak and strategic essentialism. So I don't want to be too like single-mindedness in this relationism. Like, sometimes to live, we have to employ these substantialist frameworks in certain ways. So this is just a troubling, and I think Spivak's work is incredible on that. And that sort of ties me back to Chris's idea. So I've come full circle from Jonathan back to Chris, where I was furiously writing down notes. And maybe I do sound like a true believer and quite evangelical sometimes on, if we think about not community, but a relational matrix, and who your matrix touches and what is touched within your matrix, in terms of thinking about the point you were making about belonging in community and how to destabilize this, because still this idea of community sometimes embeds a homogeneity within that community, but within are contestations and among are contestations. I don't know, how does that resonate for you, Chris, in that thinking? Sorry, I said a lot there. I'll be quiet.
Thank you. I see Birgit's hand up. I don't know if you want to reply something right here, Chris, or maybe later. Okay, Birgit?
Yeah, just to reply also to Jonathan, and I think that the whole idea of having this singular identities, that there is a possibility of scholar and then an activist, and we're talking about, substantialist categories. I think that this is actually what Angela Davis, Edward Said, and others are totally problematizing. They're basically saying also that, and Jonathan pointed this out, that a lot of people do not have this privilege to only sit at the university and think whether they will listen, work with others, right? So there is this whole politics of knowledge production here. And what I'm also thinking about is that I would like to hear, like, what do you think is your role in academia? If it is in any way connected to the pursuit of social justice, then the questions that arise, I think, for all of us, and I think this needs to be like an ongoing question. And the reason why we said that we need to center thought companionship is that most of the writers who talk about this, scholar activist, they do not want to freeze this discussion. They want to say that this needs to be like a collaborative enterprise. So we constantly need to push us in thinking through what these different hyphenated roles mean, and how in different situations we have different dynamics of these identities. So yeah, if it's like social justice, for example, if I see myself as working towards that, and dying, and linking here with what Rebecca said, is that if kind of feminist scholarship, especially speaking to epistemology, has noticed that previously it has been white men who have universalized their experience, we do actually need to inquire, be at least curious what do those who have been oppressed, have experienced? How do they make sense of the concepts that we try to explain? So in this sense, I guess, one concept that Monica and Rebecca and myself, we sat with is this kind of humility and, whether we have this responsibility to co-produce knowledge, in what instances. And we thought that, or at least maybe, I don't want to speak actually for others, but I definitely think that this is the brilliant kind of radical relational energy that relationalism can bring, in a sense that there is this complexity of knowing something, and you usually do not do it alone. So the question is that, do you actually question yourself when you rely on certain scholars in knowing something, or whether you actually also think like, should there be other communities who I think with? I'm sorry, it's always like, it comes out as substantialist because I somehow have to name things, but I think that this kind of knowing and the processes that go into this, it's such a relational process. I had another point, I forgot about it. So if someone else wants to add.
I just wanted to say it's in Pacific time 2:26, and we have a few minutes left. I wanted to rescue what you were saying, Birgit, the humility value, because I think that is central to radical relationism, in the sense that we may be naming things, we may be being strategically essentialist here and there, but it doesn't mean that that is the final say, or universal, or good for everyone, all peoples and all time. I'm currently, and I wanted to share this as well, working, as I was saying, on a book on race and racialization, and I have discovered a few things, and I'm working on it from an autoethnographic perspective. I've discovered that I have so much privilege, and I'm a racialized woman, but I've got a lot of privilege in my life, middle class, loving parents. And even there's a whole lot of, I'm gonna call it racial healing, because one of my teachers basically on this path calls it that, but it's healing in general, and there's a lot of that humanity needs to be doing if we're going to, I don't know, I don't want to say overcome, but eventually leave behind these terrible habits that the humans have of hating on each other and being genocidal, and somehow trying to justify it like it's a natural thing that we do. So in that process, in the process of racial healing for me, for myself, in this particular work that I'm doing, but it's, as I was saying, healing in general, the role of personal and family stories have been so important in this work. And those stories basically foreground the relationality and deep embeddedness of uh, ourselves in our communities and with other people, but also in the world that we live in, right? That is one point, and also in doing that, and for the purposes of healing, just to be, I don't know, better, more healthy in this world. I think humility is also so important, because, as has been mentioned, we may know something, but we always know it from our perspective. And again, this is not the first time we're saying it, but it's so important to, like, I'm thinking about standpoint epistemology, or maybe the whole perspective of the cyborg that has been mentioned in these discussions before, right? That how we know something, we know it from the perspective that we know it, and deeply embedded, embodied organisms that we are. And as I was saying, that individuality, and this has been mentioned before, is this like principle, together with meritocracy and capitalism, etc., right? That people seem to be so attached to. And I think radical relationism goes a long way in helping us deal with those fixations, if you will, of or values of this culture in which we live, that it's so hard to extricate oneself from. And again, humility, right? So it's, circling back and saying, yeah, this is what it is, and I'm saying it, but it doesn't mean that it's the last word. And Chris, raise your hand if you'd like to add something, and we've got like 1 minute.
Oh my gosh. I was thinking about reflexivity because when we ask for instance, what's the role of the intellectual, there's a bit of a slippery slope towards that being a little bit essentialist, as if there is this Platonic ideal of the role of the intellectual that's just out there and we need to know what it is. And for me, it comes down to, what do I want? What am I trying to do? And but if what I'm trying to do is to propagate like democracy, egalitarianism, then I can't set myself up as an authority. I have to practice humility. So the humility is reflexively connected to the thing that I'm trying to do. It's the goal and the methods feed into each other and reinforce each other. And that's what I think about when I think of reflexivity. So I wonder if that's maybe a useful way for us to think about like the different things that we're doing as intellectuals. Because I mean, to talk about healing or to talk about democracy or to talk about justice, or these are all slightly different frames. These are slightly different intentions. So and the methods and tactics and practices we use will ideally cohere with the thing that we're aiming towards. Is that helpful?
I
A
think
helpful
so,
notion.
and thanks so much for bringing up reflexivity, because it really is foregrounding these values that we've been talking about, of humility versus objectivity, which is like what we should aspire to, and it's all, written in stone, and that is the real truth. But again, this is what radical relationism opens up, troubles, disrupts, and can become a really interesting critical approach to working ethically for social justice. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. And I am going to